Okay, let's talk about reverbs. So I decided to make this video because I've had this conversation recently with students and they found it to be very interesting, and I figured I'd put it online. That's kind of the extent of it. So I want to talk about reverb, and we'll talk a little bit about basic types of reverb and then some common historical reverbs that are respected, I guess would be the term, that are very popular. So while I'm not going to talk about the individual parameters within reverbs, I'll expect that you kind of have that baseline knowledge and you've used a reverb before and you're kind of aware of what a reverb is in a general sense. I think I might have a video where I go over that. If I do, I'll put a card on the screen or I'll put a link in the description. But what I'm going to be talking about today is a bit more of like a historical primer on reverbs. It's like a reverb rundown of sorts. And while I feel like I shouldn't have to make this disclaimer, I am going to make this disclaimer just in case, because I know someone will show up in the comments otherwise. But this is not a comprehensive list, right? There are like a million reverbs out there. There are so many historical reverbs, even not just modern ones, right? So there are a whole bunch of very popular reverbs that could make this list and aren't on this list. I'm just kind of going over the ones that, you know, working in the studio and seeing in studios and hearing from people within the studio world. These are the ones that tended to pop up the most, and that kind of got on my radar as historical reverbs first, you know, as I was learning about it. So that's just my personal experience. Before we dig into individual reverb units, I do think it's relevant to talk about the broad categories of different types of reverbs, because that is going to inform our discussion. So some common reverb types that you'll see are going to be like room, hall, chamber, plates, springs, impulse response. Those tend to be the big categories of reverbs that we see. And essentially, reverbs are often mimicking an acoustic space, right? In the origins of the reverb is that it's mimicking an acoustic space. So just keep that in mind. But, you know, we have halls, for example, where they're mimicking bigger spaces. So they're going to have a long decay time. They're going to have a lot of reflections. We're going to have like chambers and rooms where it's then getting smaller in size. So you're going to have a smaller space than it's mimicking with shorter decay times. And in the case of the chamber reverb is often mimicking something that recording studios would often build, which is a small chamber. So it'd be like a cement or a tiled little space, like a small room that were used to create reverb. And some of them were pretty small, right? Some of them were not big enough for a person to really comfortably exist in. So, but they would build these spaces because they were a smaller, more affordable way to get some reverb into a mix than, for example, having a big, wonderful live room, which would be more like a hall, right? So as we go on, you might kind of notice this pattern, right? A lot of these reverb solutions were created because they were either more portable or more affordable, or a smaller version of the alternative, which is actually having a physical space that has really beautiful reverb, right? So then we get into the family of plate or spring reverbs. And so with plate reverbs, they would send signal down and it would go through a transducer that would then vibrate a metal plate, like an actual physical metal plate, right? And often they would use a magnetic driver to actually vibrate that plate. And there's actually a book that I have that I'll try to find a photo and put it in you know, on the screen somewhere for you. But you can actually see one of the spikes that would vibrate the metal plate within a famous plate reverb that we'll talk about here in a minute. But it's so cool to see that, because usually that's like blocked off. You can't normally see that on the device unless you're like tearing it apart, which is not advisable if you're not a professional. But now I'm getting distracted. Basically, plate reverb, right? You're sending the signal down through a transducer to something that's vibrating an actual physical metal plate. And then that signal would then be picked up and brought back into your system to be recorded, right? So oftentimes it would be picked up using something like a contact microphone or a pickup, that type of thing. And you know, a spring reverb was the same idea, except you were vibrating a spring instead of a metal plate. So spring reverbs were often more compact than some of the famous plate reverbs from back in the day. But it was the same idea. They were sending signal down and then vibrating a spring and then picking up that signal and bringing it back in to be recorded. And, you know, in the early days of recording, these were often used when something like a chamber or a hall was not practical. So these were mechanical solutions to the reverb question, right? Is how do we get beautiful, accessible reverb? But it's good to note that they do sound slightly different than the real thing, right? So each of these has its own type of sound. and it's a fun thing to explore. So if you have not explored that already, I recommend that. Okay, so with that said, let's talk about some of the actual units from back in the day. So these are some of my favorites. These are some of the ones that I've run into the most. These are some of the ones that I learned about first when it comes to historical reverbs. So the first one is the EMT 140, and that's a plate reverb. It's from 1957. I did have to check that date before shooting this video. I don't have that on the top of my head, but it's a very, very famous plate reverb. And I think it's important to keep in mind that although these units are very big, they're about 600 pounds. They're very big and heavy. They're pretty tall too. I forget exactly how tall, but if they're sitting on the floor, they probably reach up to about there. They're a big rectangular thing that lives in the studio, and they can take a lot of space. They're very heavy to move, so they're very impractical to move around. You kind of want to just set it and use it wherever it exists within the studio. But it was a smaller solution than having something like a chamber often was. It was a smaller solution than other options at the time. And again, you know, because it's a plate reverb, they're using a transducer to actually drive the movement in the metal plate. And it's the shape that it is because it has a big metal sheet within it. So most of the unit is a big metal sheet, and then there's the framework around it and the mechanisms within it. So I'll put a picture on the screen. It might be already on the screen. But you know, it's shaped the way that it is. It's a big, awkward rectangle because it has a big metal plate within it. It's an actual sheet of metal that's inside that unit. So, you know, just like any physical plate reverb, signal was sent into it, and then it would vibrate the metal plate, and then this one used pickups to then take that signal out and bring it to whatever you're using to record. And what else about the EMT 140? I know it was originally in mono, so that can feel very limited to those of us that are used to all the digital options out there today. And they did eventually come out with a stereo version in the 60s. I think it was in 1961 that they came out with that option. So it was originally in mono. And the other interesting thing that I think is pretty cool is it used an actual damping pad to control the decay time. So it was an actual I believe is like a soft absorptive pad of some sort that would clamp down on the plate to adjust that decay time for the reverb. So I think that's pretty cool. And other than that, I know that there are a lot of digital reproductions out there. There are a bunch of companies that make plug-in versions of the EMT 140. So like Universal Audio and Altiverb, and there's a bunch of others that make them. So if you want, you can access a plugin that is mimicking this reverb, and they do mimic them pretty well, but it's good to keep in mind that because this is such a physical, mechanical device, each one was different, right? So tuning one of these is apparently a huge nightmare and very difficult to do, and it's very hard to find someone to actually fix one of these as a result, right? But the other result out of that is, you know, even if they sounded pretty similar when they were first created, they all age differently. There was enough variation within the actual physical hardware units that, you know, when plug-in manufacturers sat down to create a digital version of this reverb, which units they choose as their source units can change how the plugin ends up behaving in the long run. So different plugins will be modeled after different units, and that affects how they work. I hope that makes sense. Let me know if it doesn't make sense. It's something to keep in mind because people will sometimes be like, oh, well, this plugin doesn't sound like this unit. And it's like, yes, but which unit did you listen to compared to which one did they model it after? It's something to consider at the very least. So while we're on the EMT train, let's talk about the EMT 250. So it was the first digital reverb. I believe it came out in the 70s. Yep, hard cut. I just looked it up. It came out in 1976. And I had the pleasure of hearing one of these at the Village Studios in LA. And it is beautiful. I love the way this thing sounds. It's kind of fun too. I'll put a photo on the screen, but it has like these like lever switches on the top of it, which are really fun to use. But this one's cool and it's significant. It's historically significant because, like I said, it was that first digital reverb. But something happened, right? Lexicon came out with some digital reverbs that then competed with this one. And this one was twice as expensive originally than the Lexicon 224, for example. So, you know, Lexicon arguably became more popular as a result of that. But, you know, the EMT 250, it wasn't just a reverb. They also had chorus and phaser functions within it. So I think that's pretty cool. I really like the EMT 250. If you've ever heard one or had an opportunity to hear one, I would definitely check it out. That's one of my favorites. But let's move on and talk about the Lexicon reverbs. So there are actually a bunch of Lexicon reverbs. If you want to dig into it, I'd suggest doing a little deep dive on them. They're really cool. They're the ones that if you go into a studio and they have one, they have like the controller often on the big soundboard, like often paired with like an SSL or something. So it has that controller unit, which I'll put a picture on the screen so you don't have to imagine it. But if you've ever spent some time hanging out in a studio and talking about like physical, like old school reverb units, the Lexicon probably has come up. So here I'm going to talk about the 224 and the 480L, but just keep in mind that there are a whole bunch of Lexicon reverbs. It's not just these two. So it's said that Lexicon was trying to do a loose reproduction of the EMT 140, that it's loosely based on the EMT 140. So Lexicon was trying to do what nowadays we might refer to as an early digital reproduction. But you know that these Lexicon reverbs would not hold up to modern standards of what a digital reproduction should be and should sound like. It was early days, right? But I think it's interesting to take note of because it tells you a little bit about what Lexicon was trying to do, how they were trying to grab their part of the market, what their goal was, and it gives you a little bit of a historical perspective that I think is pretty interesting. So the Lexicon 224 was the first to come out in 1979, and it was lush and dense. It had smooth decays. It had like spacey vibes. You think like Blade Runner, that kind of thing. And then later the 224 XL came out, the 480L, the PCM series. So they have a whole PCM series. There's like the PCM 60, 70, 80, 90, I believe, and there might be a few others. I forget all of them. But those came out like into the 80s and the 90s. I think there was a PCM 96 that was in the early 2000s. There's a whole series of them if you want to dig into that. And you know, this is kind of just a quick primer that I'm trying to put together for a few different types of classic reverb units. So if you come up with any interesting information about any of these or any other reverb units that were coming out in the same era, please put it in the comments below. I'm sure we'd all be very interested to see it. So I'm running out of time here before my next thing, but there are a couple more things that I wanted to talk about. So one is the historical perspective. I think it's so cool that a lot of these reverbs originated from a long line of people going, oh, well, what can we do that uses fewer resources than actually having this big, beautiful acoustic space for our reverb? You know, what's cheaper, what's smaller, what's more transportable, what's an alternative thing that we can do? And they realize, you know, we can run signal to a plate and vibrate it and then bring that back in. We can run signal to a spring. That's a whole nother one that I mentioned, but we didn't even talk about examples yet today. And the spring reverbs are so cool because a lot of the old spring reverbs, they had an actual like small spring being wound up and down within the unit. And the manufacturers, if you read about it, they'll talk about how they would bend the string in strategic spots, or they would burn it, or they would damage it somehow so that it would get this beautiful sound that's not too harsh, right? And that stuff is so cool. And the thing is, like, it came from this world of trying to save resources, trying to find an alternate option, but then it opened up. It's like there's a side effect of it opening up this whole world of different types of reverb sounds that are available. And some of those reverb sounds aren't even mimicking a certain space, right? So it's like we have like the reverbs that mimic a church or a cathedral, or they mimic a hall, or they mimic some kind of space. And then we have reverbs that are mimicking a process like the plate reverb or the spring reverb. And I think that's so cool that that whole side of things kind of just stemmed from how do we save resources? How do we do something that's similar but a little different? I don't know. And then the other thing that I wanted to talk about, besides just listing actual reverb hardware units, which we can totally do in another video. If you want to hear more, just let me know in the comments below. But the other thing that I wanted to talk about is the idea that knowing about this history can really inform your knowledge of your reverb plugins. And that goes beyond just plugins that are mimicking these actual hardware units. You know, we have like the UAD plugin that's mimicking the EMT 140, for example. We have different plugins that are directly advertising that they are mimicking these units. But then there's a whole world of reverb plugins that aren't directly saying that that's what they're doing, but if you dig into it and you read up on, sometimes it's what the actual manufacturer has published, sometimes it's people that were a part of the process coming out and talking about it, but a lot of Reverb plugins actually are being informed by these old hardware units. So for example, I believe the Valhalla plate reverb, if you dig into it, there's a spot on their website where they actually talk about how they used an EMT 140 in the process of designing that plate reverb. So that plate reverb is influenced by this history of hardware units that we're talking about today. And I think that's really cool. And there are so many other examples like that where you dig into it and it's like, oh, for example, Seventh Heaven, it's mimicking the Bricasti M7. And I don't know, I just think that's so cool. So I think that's it. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Let me know if you want more videos like this in the future. Please subscribe to my channel. Please check out my Patreon if you feel so inclined. You can join for as little as $1 a month, and my Patreon helps me stay independent as a channel. So please check that out if you feel so inclined. And I come out with new videos every Wednesday, and thank you so much for hanging out. Okay. So some common Brad. I feel like I just rambled for like a long time, and now it's going to become a video, and I don't know if we like that. Do we like that? Did we like this? Please tell me. I have no idea. I try to vary things a little bit, you know, so it's not like all Pro Tools and tips and tricks or all mixed stuff or all, you know, stuff like this. I try to vary it a little bit so that there's some interest in variety, and part of me is just doing whatever I find interesting, but let me know. Let me know what you think. That helps. That kind of feedback helps. Okay, bye.